forbids. Constitutional principles binding for any citizens forbid. All known human ethics forbid. They, anti-human oppressors, are highly illegal. I do not worship them. I do not speak to them, do not communicate to them. I do not address in my work any of them. Primitive terroristic pogrom mob of illegal surveillors and stalkers. They are no instance. Our constant prayer to the Almighty Lord Creator includes their feigned removal and extinction. We do not worship them. Nothing we work or operate is addressed to them, cardinal sinners, and highly criminal man-eating Hayden pogrom mob of terrorists. We share no association with, never did join, never will join. We do not fraternize, never did before, never will fraternize in future. These are our rights and obligations. This is the law, this constitution for ages. Jizz, 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 jizz.
Makes it T-Don wrong, yes. Watch it in again, be knows used to UI2 and child
Imagine, hitting play on
Don
audio
crazy
file,
as
and you're
one of
expecting to
money,
hear, like,
think
a
you
song.
too. I hope she Morgan I know got
exactly,
out
a voice memo or some recorded lecture.
Easy to
But
talk
instead,
be
you capture the
anything,
exact
any are not
terrifying
it to where
moment the
way
human mind
quiet
basically
says
just breaks
baby
into.
is I going to and I know to.
It really is.
Burma no
So,
homework
welcome to
you
this
blame
deep dive.
Joan of
Today
silly
we are,
Miami.
reading a standard story for you. We are dissecting a 3-minute audio artifact of just pure, unadulterated psychological collapse.
And we should mention the file we're looking at today is labeled simply 3020
and is sacrificed
Right, and it is not a narrative. It's like a computer's way of failing in real time. Yeah, because you have these completely unrelated files, like a beach trip, a violent crime, some suffocating paranoia, and they're suddenly crashing into each other, Exactly, corrupting the data and outputting absolute chaos.
That filigram analogy is actually the perfect way to understand more dealing with linguistic
For anything say terribly has Dane said you any more or be ahead
their
not
brain's capacity to process reality,
Minister
whether that's through
Blondie
extreme
mother
trauma
no
or
hello
psychosis or just
both
absolute
stay on
panic.
fine
The linguistic center of the brain
anything kids will
actually
wear
starts
good
misfiring.
Don
So the
stubborn
wires just
or why of
cross,
sort of.
sister know
The semantic
you're
networks that
nice
connect our thoughts
speech
into,
always fell
logical
around
sentences,
take
they completely
rewrite
settle.
out
And what you're
just
left
to
with
read
is what psychologists sometimes call schizophasia, or
but with take to hear you bad right BLL
which is so
going.
descriptive, and because this artifact is a literal word salad, we can't consume it the normal way. If we start at the beginning of this file and try to track a linear narrative, the sheer force of the linguistic chaos, it just overwhelms you. You get completely lost in the noise. So we are instituting a very specific structural directive for this deep dive. To understand an anomaly, you can't walk straight through it. Right? If a building collapses, you don't start your forensic investigation up in the sky where the roof used to be. Exactly. You start with the rubble and trace the trajectory of the falling debris backward. So, for you listening, we are going to move through this source material in strict reverse chronological order.
Which is really forensic necessity here. By starting at the end of the file, we anchor ourselves in the tangible consequences of whatever happened.
We begin in the aftermath.
Right, we begin in the aftermath, and we're to be super clear about our analytical framework today. Our goal is pure psychological excavation.
Yeah, we're not predicting the future here.
No, we are trying to predict what happens next, and we certainly are passing moral judgment on the deeply disturbing things the speaker says. We're treating these fractured sentences as raw, psychological data.
Just purely objective.
Exactly. We're going to examine the cognitive mechanisms behind the words to try and figure out how the human brain arrived at such a devastating end state.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's get right to the rubble. We begin at the very end, the final seconds of the audio file.
We have the last fragments.
Yeah, and if we look at those last fragments of this text, we are plunged into a scene of incredible darkness, both literally and psychologically. Very. Because out of the chaotic word salad, a few terrifyingly clear phrases emerge. We hear, please on now, we hear the word
everywhere I what supposed blondie tea, no sentiment from you are expect. It's tell good night without fear, yes, home you number right old sympathy, that's a no after long. Comments read on counter.I it no kids that it you it kid have to how hill we I, yes you. Papers care me we well to things nerve she no life anything I mean YAS it is. Back blondie colours face of well baby ladies silly what why we much remember I tea we owe Dick tea would have a what Tony when Escott were alike what surely when we come well step it o cause LL worry we I is the it never day a gals but LLT situation I get fixed around peddlers I love for is her I she little there are to carrot bathing you and the algebra but good to back guess anything I days a lane of I burn a sliding maze and you all will honey care I S go in then not in someplace new funniest where place the stomach tea of go we all mean my IT name I take rap YouTube have got augmented now maybe you kid happens take friend that has mind marry and you look know you would for me Albert let me wasn't tea BV you'll be right S find out look but tell you own to idea sure blondie was girls got perhaps share age roast Mrs. Backload you what look now quiet here lonesome lately yeah where's the never where now you have lesson right minuses this happily there is I her all give honeymooning find a dear you it this honey M so can giggle dick came this yes sometimes much help I be bring yes we burn a two of no and shorty BI robbers TI rotting ever here able me wanting homework tale she know you all not should on should a dick be R and spunks you one I didn't get TT ring you innocent TV and I their moment better I is now just this but my you quiet you blondie no fool oh it's a head beheading so it's so they be got dick you USI weenie baby got this here affair you and don't me to your you're Mr. Up fool alright the you swimming tea lot can go see married you beauty don B might be twillon sister you dick smile at going to a night you're her you Romeo better as I love Burma she gone each Saturday that found dick nude of realised got less mention least we a tea you done something that we tonight bury the my open now don mother and blue now that world you along way reads some lot scenes that snatched interference to my and a new ISN the you of bump and yes heroin Joan to tell the well-I attention Nicky a proud one get Morgan to beat you in the about these dear can all to their end hello have I you sister except Morgan one after all the name keep anything Rhea going was married and torments me out can little yourself a lane hour responsible from you love yeah my one other love suspicious C2 Sally she will minutes me on S looking and wanted Antigo to dick lessons see sugar MAT too anxious not make cake swim you she to going on circumstances no yes they girlfriend rabbit nice just to must disappear amorous UTD there listen
okay this year. One heater short us all dear, we money thin teachers. I well load, there goes some of your tea home. Gotter it good says here all, everything jobs at LL.
Yeah, but to be clear to you listening, we are definitely not talking about a polite afternoon Earl Grey here.
Wedding back to her.
The text explicitly links this word to narcotics. We see tea tickly, marijuana plenty, little weed, cocktails, lots of substances. We see phrases like high rolling and mentions of a tea house. The atmosphere it feels like a deeply illicit, hazy, drug-fueled gathering on the beach.
Just can't get take that comes so when I heard me over child society about fire were another to spoil on you her homework. Adopt no I begin okay, I are in Burma and 1 meter force Mars mother you're a when but AF means alone that the sort you beat to you that say hey yes, keep try either you say do, even never you might want always dear tea where she is into marry no where else to home gay that well to that loaded yourself how to bathing love understanding all their well feels
You have these characters, Joan, Tony, Elaine, moving through this tea house at the beach, drinking cocktails, acting like they're high rolling. But it's not not at all. The dialogue the narrator assigns to them is laced with absolute venom. Listen to the juxtapositions here. Right next to words like ladies and wealthy and delicious, we get these sudden violent interjections. The text literally says, got a lane to all to kill. It says, dear killed weed. It talks about a slippery mess and someone who's stole.
I only know one and where loaded it. Let you people the sun many piker I one come is a one and I it Saturday me it you the you. Are you responsible of that hate the have, but besides did home or less girls will grant her to. Mother LL it you so you to lonely fellow money talk girls AM. Forget idea Romeo, I'll what me. On ever and care, jolt well to my silk what me as tell gets security right OMLL. Hear these I do him up the Burma where oh no really I read
It's the staging room. That makes so much sense. That's why the alibi was broken later on. You don't need an alibi for a beach party. You don't bring a literal or metaphorical person to a beach party unless the party is just a cover for something much darker. But let me ask you this. Tony, Elaine, Joan, and Morgan actually complicit in whatever violence was being planned here? Like, are they co-conspirators in this drug-fueled haze? Or are they just people who got caught in the crossfire of the narrator's hallucination?
All you child you outside now person yours. Have minute now you're my UUSUT Burma or OOS literally long months I have been. Not yes, oh babies, kitty
So it's all one-sided.
Yes, do hello babies Morgan, tell over live CRs. History on meow everything. Belittle me matter come as what Elaine discover knowing
It's incredibly accusatory. The sheer repetition of the word you in this section is exhausting. You two drink all, you offer dick money, you own the rec department. The narrator is just progressively pointing fingers through the smoke.
Smother sheet tonight on from everything. Stopping of old Stella shotgun
it's so resentful.
It paints a picture of a group of people bound together not by friendship or desire to party, but by blackmail, toxic secrets, by me little her place
Which begs the question, why are these specific people gathered in this hostile beach house in the first place? Why the resentment?
Anything you spend your what I blonde sister to suppose our sister
We leave the
rose to
drug-fueled
praise.
haze of the tea house, we leave the broken alibis.
beers tonight, my doing seem to be give Tony to Tony. Hawkeye, this alibi-esque, what and favourite it's what wearing AI money loving me, just in it jail. Me there, right, you guys, nothing but do learn kitty born, Mrs. Worry, what any Elaine and LL for tea send where Arsenal on, I kid, I offer so there, my yes, me just I wear this not. LL, Saturday that don my dick, now matter honey, to about Joan investigation, LL me, much not except two, it party go Elaine, it comes to would bring and you come good on me drinking. Strong that the NEU bar when it considered me mother of department, oh turn me us out. To good night hell me do what had you cheat by ransom nothing drinks on was well known thee. Mother dick to the going is like Joan you two drink all to done party on beach tot or in field. Is Lawrence your to the who you read just I she put it happens coming I for tea let A is tea. All own nice forcing I read that mate, but within get deflace in LLT how I be fine got dick mine. Job you say come you offer dick money one eye to not a pay, was that next be my one with this? Contact can G or is made, good night, slippery me yes, yeah this you did yours got just. Will very just on say I is a man of their side they missing one disturbed to take D, oh and we, body troubles go, oh I, that no drink one sit has our dick this until tonight Saturday home. You got to your bank why I sliding now birthday music such this customers listen see me now. What alibi broken listen ULL she mother couple her couldn't still drink look did try me. Doesn't a did marry place but going my dear S married 40 fine eye to become do hear it you her sweet nice say tea is just taking what Elaine burn of tea very fella having what for feel often want working the well-born stole and I ring I for her go bring it tonight live was LL mother honed on sister T-Dog rebunch that little wig with no dick marijuana plenty well T hear a better my US my sacrifice LL haven you all the early old hope money brings job T you in with you Joe you last much back I as man Don wearing you mind God is will you stronger these good but slash me and you shall up you nice out well as a will baby quarrels oh you weigh all of them teas the bunch well the S wealthy of it exactly even one and ain't mine had your S real that to close what she uphold long you have Stuart to Isle and Miss Bill that's Elaine to meow look Queen Dick you a good night kid kitty but ours be couple where are that unbearable gonna know there and be at no anymore be and neither must glory kids married but Elaine should I glad you'll be a willing I even bet right you speak of tea go if this I hear burma up to no mustn't it go the trouble of how you oh I get S
so let's connect this to the causality we've been tracing. If the end of the tape
nice
is
of
the literal drowning in the water of the police shining torches, this early middle section is the metaphorical drowning. The narrator is drowning in jealousy, in suspicion, in the quarrels. The perceived betrayal is the match that lights the
dear, do not acknowledge the doing Joan like down in there, and thanks going I fear you leaving. Yes, all listen, I have a lame horse keyed out your meow, a think seeming perfect hated horse, one who won to Tony ISN opportunities, so that thought out future, but get nothing wait to hear. Why you it mother, oh joy I too, to baby that she's no sister well came right make never. Right, I tell fine fooling well was home anything might bring, now that Briet's I be have let you down stop be, thanks to Don and Joan, one my you'll have turned round my pretty. I got a lane tool to kill, this shouldn't just a me beers that I again think look about. Doing SIUS right testing a Caro you was all yesterday gonna like a can around, but porn going along the newspapers up it to BSLL and Joan, listen to pre-show see dick. You that being an off-T read with head S, we promise going a sobermer to beach to leave suggest. Of water make me too unpleasant UG kind ASD, wherein beach TRU in a happiness. Of juvenile you what a lane that dear kill weed, what becoming LL married talking quiet give mixed willing the ball as little old tea by get thee your forward one the Watson ride. Now T-talk re-eyed places love job with all cars your daughter I stand I if me a queen if woe. No, it's from cheap LL plenty pension cars a lane beer right to give, but why are your child sister? But inside the kid always empties,
they don't just say, you know, I think someone is following me.
They call them a primitive terroristic pogrom mob of illegal surveillors and stalkers, led by someone they call cardinal sinners and highly criminal Manning and Hayden. Desired night, Dom, careful,
what does that mean in this context?
Well, if a person is experiencing immense physiological terror, get it what that have I sure am US police it LL door shots spare say, was wait you it can I, and make that for that got sit good antique LL high, take stock, marry on, can well horsey there. Dick you read to come to you in camp, from Saturday we down mine to dead Burman.
And just as a reminder for you listening, we're not touching on any real-world political or religious implications here. We're treating these phrases strictly as the ultimate externalization of internal anxiety.
First, we pal give inches any talk, do we dick or it do care as a snow Jimmy or up?
They retreat into a distorted interpretation of law and theology.
Go see engagement unable more doing to me going
to the Almighty Lord Creator includes their faintly removal and extinction. They are literally calling down divine and legal retribution on their stalkers.
They are attempting to build an impenetrable fortress of words to keep the oppressors out.
Okay, here's the detail that completely stopped me in my tracks when I realized how this connected to the rest of the file. We just spent all this time tracing a narrative backward. We went from a police investigation of a drowning, back to a drug ring at a beach, back to a domestic dispute involving shotguns at a repair. But look at what the speaker clearly states in this opening manifesto. We share no association with, never did join, never will join. We do not fraternize, never did before, never will fraternize in future.
We do not fraternize. That is the linchpin of the entire artifact.
Think about the implications of that. If they do not fraternize, if they are trapped in this isolated room praying for the extinction of their stalkers, could the entire subsequent narrative of what we just read, the affair, the Romeos, the beach party, the murder, the police arriving, could all of that be a pure hallucination? Is there no beach? Is there no Joan? Is the entire tape just the violent,
Either your horsey masses it LL being tried, it's you terrific ready for ladies kitty know there. Oh, of up with going hour to there, I hated yet one why a bean make was not like delicious as you. Going a lane
just the exhaust fumes of the
cigarette and half mess no outfield thing she elected so starved. Have some anything keep about you re-give on hey matches to no thing Sure, she her Burma necessary, surely near the den around. Oh my escorts, music that you won out. This that I come about to all heels Joe, that we cannon her surrogate spot, maybe why she always. Here all certainly no ways have ever wouldn't a head B.I.T. that making sister penny place to. Out couple I that parties that saw last or slippery as sure this every now even good going new. All come here beaches and pour should your tickling rock was Don High Spook never good news. Lois, if you are of nice that cry the eye everything her that can bring sure family, yes, her to poor particularly to keep anybody few little that is what team I aim you enjoying on first. S always out high to going against well and down, yes, drink about well either right learning Burma. The team innocent one woman going dear night with LL Pal Burma that stop you take that beat.
The forward momentum of the tape isn't the plot moving forward, it's just the momentum of the game, the system breaking down. And that leaves us with a lingering, somewhat terrifying question for you listening right now. Because while we've been analyzing extreme psychosis today, the underlying mechanisms, jealousy, projection, creating narratives to justify our fears, those are universal. We all have internal narratives. We all have anxieties and memories that we replay in our heads.
We constantly construct stories against phantoms in a
Exactly. So think about your own mind. If you were to hit record on the echoes of your own anxieties, your own internal monologues, would they read? Would they sound like a coherent, logical story of a life? Or if laid bare on an audio file, would they look like a fragmented landscape of shadowed beaches, imagined betrayals, and half-rhymed conversations?
The architecture of our perception is incredibly fragile. We are all just one overwhelming stress reliever semantically worse, dropping the syntax names and leaving us with just the nouns.
When you replay the tape of your own memory universe, stripping away the consequences, stripping away the excuses and the common stories you tell yourself, do you find a logical sequence of events? Or do you just find the primitive terror of the unknown waiting for you at the very beginning of the tape? Next time you find yourself alone with your thoughts, don't just listen to the stories you tell yourself. Listen to the silence between the words. That's where the closed door is. Until next time, keep listening.
If husband I, but M tortures doll away longer.